Communications officer Sarah Chen had been staring at her monitor for the past 6 hours, watching the endless scroll of background radiation, stellar emissions, and the occasional automated beacon. Watchtower 7, humanity's deep space monitoring station at the edge of explored space, was not known for excitement. Most days passed in comfortable monotony, exactly as designed. The station's purpose was simple: listen to the universe and catalog what it heard. But something had been nagging at Sarah for the last 20 minutes, a pattern in the noise, too regular to be natural, too faint to be obvious. She isolated the frequency and fed it through the analysis suite, watching as her AI assistant began to strip away layers of interference and decay. The signal had traveled far, degraded by distance and time, but there was definitely something there. When the first words resolved from the static, Sarah's hand froze over her coffee cup. To anyone listening: "We are slaves of the Krynn Empire. Please. 600 years of bondage. They take our children. Please help us." The message repeated, fragments of desperate hope broadcast into the void. Sarah played it again, her heart hammering. The AI identified multiple languages, some matching entries in the Galactic Council's linguistic database, others completely unknown. She pulled up the signal analysis. This transmission had been broadcasting for at least 40 years, probably longer. 40 years of calling into the darkness, hoping someone would answer. Sarah reached for the comm panel with shaking hands. This was beyond her authority, beyond standard protocols. But some things transcended protocol. Chen to Captain Webb: "Sir, you need to hear this. Right now." 3 days later, Captain Marcus Webb of the Earth Diplomatic Corps stood in the Grand Assembly Chamber of Unity Station, the massive orbital headquarters of the Galactic Council. The chamber was a monument to galactic cooperation, a vast amphitheater that could hold representatives from all 47 member species. Holographic systems ensured everyone could see and hear regardless of their sensory configurations. The architecture was deliberately peaceful, all flowing curves and soft light, designed to encourage harmony and consensus. Webb had been to the chamber a dozen times since Earth joined the Council 8 years ago. He'd presented reports on human colonization efforts, participated in trade negotiations, even given a well-received lecture on human art. This visit felt different. The recording Sarah Chen had discovered burned in his pocket like a coal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into something that would change everything. The council was in afternoon session, dealing with a trade dispute between two species whose names Webb still struggled to pronounce. He waited for the appropriate break, then requested emergency session time. The request itself raised eyebrows. Humans were still newcomers, still learning proper decorum. Emergency sessions were for established members, not enthusiastic primitives who'd barely mastered FTL travel. But the request was granted, more from curiosity than respect. Webb walked to the central platform, aware of dozens of eyes, sensor clusters, and alternative perception organs focused on him. He connected his data pad to the chamber's systems and took a breath. "Honored representatives, 3 days ago, one of our monitoring stations intercepted a distress call. Before I explain further, I believe you should hear it." He played the recording. The chamber's acoustic systems were sophisticated enough to render every nuance, every layer of desperation in those voices. The message played in its entirety, nearly 2 minutes of fragmented pleas from beings who had given up hope but couldn't stop calling for help. When it finished, Webb looked around the chamber, expecting to see shock, horror, perhaps urgency. Instead, he saw something that chilled him far more than indifference. He saw discomfort, embarrassment, and from some of the older species, something that looked almost like guilt. Ambassador Theln of the Varosian Collective was the first to speak. The Varosians were an ancient species, their civilization spanning 800 years of council membership. Theln's translator rendered his clicking mandibles into smooth galactic standard. "Captain Webb, we appreciate your concern, but this matter is complicated. Perhaps we should discuss this in a more private setting." "With respect, Ambassador, I don't see what's complicated about this. These are people calling for help. Multiple species based on the linguistic analysis. They're slaves. They've been slaves for 600 years. The chamber erupted in a susurrus of conversation. Webb caught fragments through the translation systems. Typical Deathworlder reaction. They don't understand. Someone needs to explain to them how things work. Theln raised a manipulator appendage for silence. Captain Webb, please, join me in conference room 12. This discussion requires context you currently lack. Webb wanted to argue, to demand answers in the open chamber, but he recognized the political reality. He was one voice among 47, and Earth was still building its reputation. He nodded stiffly and followed Theln out of the chamber, acutely aware of the pitying looks from some delegates and the relieved expressions from others. Conference Room 12 was smaller, designed for private negotiations. Theln waited until the door sealed before speaking, his tone softer now, almost paternal. Captain Webb, I understand your reaction. When the Varosians first learned of the Krynn situation 700 years ago, we reacted similarly. Outrage, moral certainty, the conviction that action was not only possible but mandatory. Then why hasn't anything been done? Theln's sensory stalks drooped slightly, a Varosian expression of weariness. Because we tried. 612 years ago, the Council authorized a military intervention. 17 species contributed ships. The fleet numbered over 10,000 vessels, the largest military operation in Council history. We were certain of victory. Webb leaned forward. What happened? The Krynn happened. Their territory occupies over 200 star systems in the Outer Veil, a region with natural barriers that make it easily defensible. Their technology is sophisticated, their tactics brutal. But more than that, Captain Webb, they're unified in a way Council species are not. They've been an empire for 1,400 years. War is not an aberration to them, it's their natural state. You lost. We lost spectacularly. 6 million personnel dead, hundreds of ships destroyed, and we didn't free a single slave world. The Krynn pushed us back, then launched retaliatory strikes against 3 Council worlds. Eventually, we negotiated a ceasefire. The terms were simple. They stay in their territory, we stay in ours, and we don't interfere with their internal affairs. Webb felt something cold settling in his stomach. You made peace with slavers. We made peace because the alternative was mutual destruction. Captain, I've accessed your species' historical records. You understand the concept of realpolitik, yes. Sometimes the moral choice and the practical choice are not the same. The Krynn situation is a tragedy, but it's a contained tragedy. Intervention would cost millions of lives and likely fail again. How many slaves are there now? Theln hesitated. Estimates suggest approximately 4 billion sentient beings across 12 species. Some were conquered. Others were bred into servitude over generations. The situation is stable in its way. The Krynn don't expand beyond their borders anymore. They stable, Webb's voice was flat. 4 billion slaves and you call it stable. I call it reality. Captain Webb, humanity is new to galactic civilization. You're enthusiastic, idealistic, and we value that perspective. But you must understand, some problems don't have solutions. Some evils are too entrenched to uproot. We've learned to accept this. Webb stood. Thank you for the context, Ambassador. I need to make some calls. Over the next week, Webb assembled a team. Dr. Amira Okonkwo arrived first, Earth's chief xenoanthropologist and one of the few humans who'd made a serious study of Council species psychology and culture. Admiral James Kutuzov came next, pulled from his command of the Third Fleet on Webb's urgent request. Together, they requested formal meetings with senior Council leadership. The meetings were polite, thorough, and utterly damning. Dr. Okonkwo did most of the questioning, her analytical mind dissecting the situation with surgical precision. How many slaves? What species? What had been tried in the last century? What was the current strategy? The answers painted a picture that horrified the human delegation. The Council had attempted economic sanctions 40 years ago. They failed because the Krynn Empire was largely self-sufficient. Diplomatic protests were sent annually and ignored with equal regularity. The current strategy, as far as anyone could articulate, was containment and hope. Hope that the Krynn might eventually evolve toward more ethical governance. Hope that the situation might somehow improve on its own. Hope, in other words, that they wouldn't have to do anything difficult. Admiral Kutuzov sat through 3 days of meetings, saying almost nothing. He was a large man, his ancestry a blend of Russian and Kenyan lineage, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much combat to be easily shocked. He listened to the council's explanations, their justifications, their careful reasoning about why liberation was impossible. On the fourth day, in a meeting with the council's security directorate, Kutuzov finally spoke. "Why not?" The director of security, a floating jellyfish-like being named Velm, pulsed with confusion. "I'm sorry, Admiral. Why not? You've explained why it's difficult, why it failed before, why it would be costly, but I haven't heard anyone explain why it's impossible. So I'm asking, why not try?" Velm's translation matrix hummed. "Admiral, the previous intervention cost 6 million lives. And how many lives have been lost to slavery in the 600 years since? How many beings have died in chains? How many children have been bred into servitude? That's not a fair comparison. Those deaths would have happened anyway, would they?" Kutuzov's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "You don't know that. You assume it because assuming otherwise would mean confronting your failure, your choice." Ambassador Theln, who'd been observing the meeting, interjected. "Admiral Kutuzov, I respect your passion, but you're missing the fundamental calculation. The cost of intervention would be catastrophic. Millions would die in the attempt, and we would likely fail. That's not cowardice, it's basic mathematics." Kutuzov turned to face Theln directly. "Too high for whom, Ambassador? Too high for you, sitting in comfort on Unity Station? Or too high for the 4 billion beings living in chains right now? If you asked them whether freedom was worth the risk, what do you think they'd say?" The meeting ended shortly after that, the council delegation citing scheduling conflicts and the need for further consultation. Webb, Okonkwo, and Kutuzov returned to their quarters on Unity Station and sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Okonkwo spoke. "They're not going to act. They can't. It's not in their nature," Webb nodded. "Most council species evolved on what we'd call paradise worlds. Gentle gravity, stable climates, abundant resources. Cooperation came naturally to them. War to them is ritualized conflict over resources or territory. Limited, civilized. The idea of total war, of fighting to annihilation, it's alien to them, terrifying." "Earth wasn't a paradise world," Kutuzov said quietly. "We had predators that could kill us, diseases that could wipe out civilizations, ice ages and droughts and every environmental catastrophe you could imagine. We learned that threats don't go away because you ignore them. Evil unchallenged only grows." "So what do?" Webb asked. Kutuzov met his eyes. "We go home and ask our people what they want to do, because this can't be a military decision. This has to be humanity's decision." The United Earth Assembly met in emergency session 2 weeks later. The chamber in Geneva was packed, representatives from every nation and major colony attending either in person or via hologram. The debate lasted 3 days. Some argued for caution. Humanity was new to the galactic community, still establishing itself. Earth's military, while sophisticated by human standards, was tiny compared to the combined forces of the Council. Resources were limited. Colonies needed protection. This wasn't Earth's fight. Others argued from moral necessity. The recording from Watchtower 7 had been released to the public, and the response was overwhelming. Protests erupted in major cities. Religious leaders from a dozen faiths issued joint statements. The message was clear. Humanity had the capacity to act, and therefore the responsibility. On the third day, they played the full recording, not just the excerpt that had been in the news. It was nearly 10 minutes long, containing not just pleas for help but fragments of songs, poetry, the voices of children born into chains who'd never known freedom. One segment, translated from an unknown language, struck particularly deep. "We sing so our children remember they were meant to fly." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. 70% in favor of intervention. Captain Webb returned to Unity Station with Earth's position. He requested an emergency session of the full council and was granted it, likely because the council hoped to talk sense into these impulsive humans. Webb's statement was brief. "The United Earth Assembly has reviewed the situation regarding the Krynn Empire and the enslaved populations under their control. We formally request Council authorization for a humanitarian intervention to liberate these peoples and restore their autonomy. The chamber erupted. Multiple species tried to speak at once, creating a cacophony that took several minutes to resolve. When order was finally restored, the Council's response was delivered by Velm as Director of Security. Council appreciates humanity's compassion, but we must decline this request. The Krynn situation falls under the Prime Non-Interference Directive regarding internal governance of non-Council civilizations. Additionally, the Security Directorate's analysis indicates an unacceptable risk of regional destabilization and massive casualties. The Council's position remains unchanged. Containment and diplomatic engagement are the only viable strategies. Webb nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Then humanity respectfully withdraws from this discussion. We will not ask the Council to violate its principles. Thank you for your time. He left the chamber before anyone could respond. The Council representatives looked at each other, relieved. The humans had been talked down, crisis averted. They were wrong. Admiral James Kutuzov stood in the command center of Fleet Base Armstrong, humanity's largest military installation, and looked at the holographic display showing the assembly of Task Force Liberation. 200 ships, every major combat vessel humanity could spare, along with support ships, medical frigates, and supply carriers. It was humanity's largest military deployment in history, and it was utterly inadequate for a conventional assault on an empire spanning 200 systems. Good thing they weren't planning a conventional assault. Status report, he ordered. Commander Lisa Park, his chief of staff, pulled up the tactical overview. All vessels reporting ready. Stealth reconnaissance drones are prepositioned in 41 Krynn systems. Intelligence packages from the resistance movements have been integrated. Cyber warfare suite is online. We're ready to execute on your order, sir. Kutuzov studied the display. 200 ships against an empire. The Council would call it suicide. They didn't understand that humanity had learned something during their bloody history. You don't fight the enemy's strength, you break their will. One more thing before we begin, Kutuzov said. I want every person in this task force to understand what we're doing and why. This isn't a war of conquest. This isn't revenge. We're fighting to free people who have been calling into the darkness for generations. Some of our people won't come home. That's the cost, and we pay it because it's right. If anyone has doubts, now is the time to speak. The command center was silent. Then Park spoke, her voice carrying across the room. Admiral, I think I speak for everyone here when I say, let's bring them home. Kutuzov allowed himself a small smile. Then let's show the galaxy what humanity does when evil gets too comfortable. All ships jump to Phase 1 positions. Operation begins in 6 hours. The Krynn Empire had stood for 1,400 years. It had weathered the Council's intervention 6 centuries ago and emerged stronger. Its citizens believed in their racial superiority, their divine right to rule lesser species. The slave worlds existed to serve Krynn interests, a natural and proper order of things. The Empire's military doctrine was built around overwhelming force and centralized control. Their fleets were powerful, their garrison forces well-equipped. They hadn't faced a serious challenge in living memory. That was about to change. Phase 1 began simultaneously across 40 star systems. Krynn garrison commanders received no warning before human ships appeared from quantum-fold jumps, targeting with inhuman precision. Not the fortified planetary installations, those could wait. Instead, humanity struck where the Krynn were vulnerable. Every slave transport in motion was disabled, their engines destroyed but life support intact. Human boarding teams secured the ships and moved the captives to safety. Every supply depot supporting the garrison forces was obliterated. Every communication relay was reduced to debris. Every automated defense satellite found its systems compromised by cyber warfare protocols the Council species would never have developed because they feared true artificial intelligence. Within 48 hours, the Krynn Empire was blind, deaf, and paralyzed. Garrison forces on slave worlds found themselves cut off, unable to call for reinforcements, their supply lines severed. Some attempted to use civilian hostages as shields. Human response was calculated and cold. Precision strikes that eliminated the garrison troops while leaving the civilians unharmed, using weapons the Council had outlawed as unnecessarily accurate. Simultaneously, humanity did something the Council had never thought to try. They communicated directly with the enslaved populations. Broadcasts in every known language repeated continuously. "Attention enslaved peoples, liberation forces are here. This is not a raid. This is not temporary. We are here to free you. Remain calm, protect each other. Freedom is coming." On the slave world of Talmor Prime, an elderly being named Keth heard the broadcast and wept for the first time in decades. He'd been born in chains, as had his parents and grandparents before him. Hope was something he'd read about in forbidden histories but never felt. Now it flooded through him like fire. The resistance movements that had survived for generations in the shadows suddenly found themselves contacted by human special forces, offered weapons, tactical support, and coordination. Uprisings began, carefully orchestrated to minimize casualties among the enslaved population while maximizing disruption to Krynn control. The Krynn military leadership, based on their homeworld of Krynn Prime, took 6 days to understand the scope of the crisis. Their initial assessment was that this was a council operation, more sophisticated than the previous intervention but fundamentally similar. They began to mass their fleet, pulling ships from border patrol and reserve forces. Over 3,000 vessels converged on the Krynn Prime system, preparing for a counteroffensive. They were still organizing their attack wings when the minefield activated. Human stealth ships had spent weeks seeding Krynn Prime's outer system with smart mines, each no larger than a softball but equipped with sensors and maneuvering thrusters. The mines had drifted, silent and cold, waiting for the right moment. When the Krynn fleet reached optimal density, the mines struck. Not all at once, that would have been wasteful. Instead, they targeted critical ships, command vessels, ammunition carriers, tankers. The explosions created cascading failures. Ships collided trying to evade. Point defense systems fired on friendly vessels, creating chaos. In 20 minutes, the Krynn lost 800 ships without ever seeing the enemy. Admiral Kutuzov watched the battle damage assessment from his flagship and felt no satisfaction, only grim necessity. Push Phase 2. Target their shipyards and manufacturing capability. I want them unable to rebuild. The Krynn tried to adapt. They dispersed their remaining fleets, protecting individual systems rather than massing forces. Human response was immediate. Attack the dispersed forces in detail, using superior speed and coordination to engage on favorable terms. When Krynn ships tried to mass again, they found human forces had already moved on to other targets. It was a master class in asymmetric warfare, and the Krynn were unprepared for it. Their entire military philosophy was built on frontal assault and overwhelming power. They'd never learned to fight an enemy who refused to meet them head-on, who struck from shadows and vanished before reinforcements arrived. Ground operations were equally systematic. Human forces didn't just defeat Krynn garrison troops, they documented everything. War crimes tribunals would need evidence, and humanity had learned from their own dark history that evidence mattered. Every torture center was recorded in high definition. Every breeding facility was cataloged. Every execution ground was mapped and investigated. Dr. Amira Okonkwo accompanied the ground forces, her role to ensure they understood the cultural contexts of the freed populations. On the world of Veles, she watched former slaves emerge from underground bunkers, blinking in sunlight many had never seen. A human marine offered water to a child who'd never tasted anything but the nutrient paste provided by Krynn overseers. The child drank, then asked in halting galactic standard, "Are you gods?" The marine, a young woman from Detroit named Johnson, knelt down to eye level. "No, sweetie, we're just people like you, and you're free now. Nobody owns you anymore." Okonkwo documented the exchange, knowing it would be important later. This was what the Council had deemed too costly. This moment, repeated billions of times across dozens of worlds. 4 months after operations began, the last Krynn military stronghold surrendered. The Krynn Empire, which had stood for 14 centuries, effectively ceased to exist as a political entity. 12 species, 4 billion sentient beings were free. The cost to humanity: 12,000 personnel killed in action, 30,000 wounded. The cost to the Krynn military: 90% casualties. The Council had been trying to reach Earth for weeks, their messages increasingly frantic. They'd watched the operation unfold through their intelligence networks, their horror growing with each report. When Admiral Kutuzov finally agreed to meet them, he returned to Unity Station not with a fleet but with a single diplomatic vessel and a data core containing petabytes of evidence. The Grand Assembly Chamber was packed when Kutuzov arrived, every council species represented. The atmosphere was tense, fearful. They'd watched humanity dismantle an empire in 4 months using tactics and strategies that seemed almost alien in their efficiency. Kutuzov didn't make a speech. He simply connected the data core to the chamber's systems and let it speak for itself. 6 centuries of atrocities, all documented with clinical precision. The breeding programs that treated sentient beings as livestock. The torture centers that broke spirits as systematically as factories produced goods. The execution grounds where millions died for the crime of wanting freedom. The presentation lasted 4 hours. Multiple council delegates had to leave, unable to process the horror. When it finished, the chamber sat in stunned silence. Ambassador Thelm was the first to speak, his voice shaking. You cannot simply dissolve a sovereign nation. You've violated every principle of international law. International law. Kutuzov's voice was quiet, but it carried. You're lecturing us about law, you who sat in comfort for 600 years while 4 billion beings suffered. You who made peace with slavers and called it pragmatism. You don't understand what you've done. You've shown the entire galaxy that overwhelming military force can achieve any objective. You've undermined centuries of diplomatic progress. We've freed 4 billion slaves. Kutuzov's eyes were hard. Everything else is noise. Velm pulsed with agitation. The Krynn situation was stable, contained. You've destabilized an entire region. It was stable for you, Dr. Okonkwo interjected, stepping forward. Stable means unchanging. It means accepting evil as permanent. We reject that logic. You're Deathworlders, another delegate spat. You don't understand civilization, you only understand violence. Captain Webb, who'd been silent until now, laughed bitterly. You want to know what we understand? We understand that evil unchallenged grows. We understand that peace bought with others' suffering is no peace at all. And we understand that sometimes the moral choice and the practical choice are the same. You just have to be willing to pay the cost. The chamber erupted in argument. Some species defended the council's position. Others, particularly younger civilizations, asked pointed questions about why liberation hadn't been attempted sooner. The debate raged for hours. Finally, Dr. Okonkwo raised her voice over the chaos. We've been reviewing your historical databases. The Krynn aren't the only slave empire, are they? The chamber went silent. We've identified 4 other civilizations that engage in systematic enslavement of other species. All outside council space, all considered too difficult to confront. How long until you find a way to call that stable too? Admiral Kutuzov stepped forward. Earth sought your approval first because we believed in your institutions. We believed in the Galactic Council's commitment to justice. You failed. You chose comfort over righteousness and billions paid the price. We will not make that mistake again. What are you saying? Thelm demanded. I'm saying we will not ask for permission again. To every enslaved being in this galaxy, we hear you. We're coming. To every tyrant who profits from suffering, your time is ending. And to this council, you can either help us build something better or you can stay out of our way. Those are your options. The council delegates stared at the human delegation, finally understanding what they'd unleashed. These weren't the naive newcomers they'd been patronizing for 8 years. These were apex predators from a deathworld who'd climbed from the food chain to the stars, and who decided that slavery was something worth fighting over. Terrifying didn't begin to cover it. In the weeks that followed, Earth began the massive humanitarian effort of stabilizing the freed worlds. Medical teams, agricultural experts, educators, engineers, thousands of humans deployed to help societies rebuild. The Council watched, uncertain whether to be impressed or frightened by humanity's efficiency. On Talmer Prime, Keth stood in what had been the central square of his city, watching human engineers help design new infrastructure. A young human woman approached, a translator device in hand. "Sir, we're planning the memorial for the liberation. We'd like input from the local population. Do you have suggestions?" Keth thought for a long moment. A statue, a human soldier kneeling to offer water to a child. That moment when your people treated us as equals, as people worth saving, that's what we want to remember. The engineer smiled. "We can do that." "Why did you come?" Keth asked. "We are nothing to you. You risked your lives for beings you'd never met." The engineer's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "Because someone had to, and we were able, that's enough." Keth watched her walk away, and for the first time in his 70 years of life, he understood what hope felt like. Not the desperate hope of prayers sent into darkness, but the solid hope of seeing tomorrow and knowing it would be better than today. In orbit above Talmer Prime, human ships prepared to depart, their work in this system complete. But in the distance, more human fleets were already moving, heading toward the next slave empire on the list. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity didn't just make war, they made it count. And for the billions still waiting in chains across the stars, that knowledge was the most precious gift imaginable. The certainty that someone, somewhere, cared enough to act. The question now facing the Galactic Council wasn't whether humanity would continue their crusade. It was whether the Council would find the courage to join them, or whether they'd watch from the sidelines as a species they dismissed as primitive newcomers redefined what galactic civilization could mean. Ambassador Theln sat in his quarters on Unity Station, reviewing the data from the Krynn liberation. The efficiency was terrifying. The moral certainty was incomprehensible to his Varosian sensibilities. But what truly kept him awake was a simple realization. Humanity was right. 600 years of accepting the unacceptable, justified with elaborate rationalizations. 600 years of prioritizing stability over justice. And it took a species barely 8 years into galactic civilization to expose that choice for what it truly was, cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. Theln initiated a private communication with several other council members who'd expressed similar doubts. The message was brief. "We need to talk about changing our approach. The humans have shown us what's possible. The question is whether we have the courage to follow their example." The responses came slowly, but they came. Not all the council was content with comfortable paralysis. Some species, particularly those who remembered their own struggles for freedom, recognized in humanity a kindred spirit. Perhaps together they could build something better, but that was a story for another day. For now, across dozens of star systems, former slaves were waking up to their first morning of freedom, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, human ships were already moving toward the next fight, the next liberation, the next chance to prove that some things were worth fighting for. The galaxy would never be the same.